My view for the future, and this is not science fiction, it's coming, is that we're not going to help those organs limp along. We're going to replace them. Your kidneys have a problem, you're going to get a new kidney. Your heart's problem, new heart. Diabetes, we're not going to inject insulin. You're going to get a new pancreas.
Hi, I'm Maximilian Büsser, founder of MB&F. To me, watchmaking is art with a capital A. Watchmaking is about creating kinetic sculptures. Watchmaking is, more importantly, a mindset. It's a journey. The history of watchmaking is filled with adventurers, dreamers, engineers, artists who will each in their own way contribute to a better world. The watchmaking journey is first and foremost about very special individuals. Some are rebels and mavericks, and most have a little touch of madness. Now, over the years, we've come to realize that many MB&F owners are adventurers themselves. Our collectors circle called the Tribe is full of such individuals. Many have amazing lives and stories to tell, and this is why I decided to start this podcast. Today, I'm glad to welcome one of them, an engineer, an investor, and a researcher, someone who dedicated his whole life to science, someone who extends the boundaries of medicine, a great visionary who's helping deliver humanity from illness. Bill Doyle. Bill, welcome to our podcast, Tales from the Tribe.
Well, hello, Max, and I couldn't be happier to be here with you today.
It's great to have you. This podcast actually started in my mind after discussion we had together, where I casually at breakfast asked you about the future of healthcare, and I just listened for 30 minutes in awe. It was such an incredible discussion. It was not actually a discussion. I was just listening to you talking. And so I just wanted that our listeners can hear a bit of what your story is about and how you've forged your creativity, your success, your drive. Bill, tell us a bit about your story.
I'm not sure that it's going to be that entertaining, but I'm happy to talk about it. So I grew up as a poor kid outside of Baltimore, Maryland. And, my first jobs were cutting the grass at golf courses, shoveling snow, raking leaves. Because if I didn't shovel snow, rake leaves, cut grass, I wasn't going to get those Adidas sneakers that I coveted. And I wasn't going to be able to put gas in my first car, which was a 66 Chevy Bel Air. And it was one of these cars that every time I put gas in it, I had to put a quart of oil and top up the brake fluid. So that gives you a sense of what I was driving. But early on, I always was fascinated with engineering and really the story of engineers. And, without going into it too deeply, I got involved in the local science fair, believe it or not. And I did a project. I won my school science fair. That promoted me to the Baltimore Science Fair, which was held at Johns Hopkins. I happened to win that, which promoted me to what they call the International Science and Engineering Fair that, bad luck my year was being held in St. Paul, Minnesota. So I got an all expense straight paid trip to St. Paul. But I ended up winning that too. And that's really, I hate to say a science fair, but that was kind of a pivotal moment for me because the prizes that came with that included a scholarship to attend and to study at the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot, Israel. And I will tell you, this was 1979. I couldn't have found Israel on the map. I had never been out of the country, out of the U.S. Again, the furthest I had ever traveled was to dear old St. Paul at that time. But the next thing I know, I found myself on a 747. And this was in the days when the flights were from JFK to Tel Aviv. Depending on the winds, you might have to stop for gas in Athens. We ended up making it all the way on one tank. And the door opened and I was in a different world. I was all of a sudden at Ben-Gurion Airport. There were soldiers guarding the terminal. And I was picked up and brought to the Weizmann Institute, where I had the opportunity to study physics. And I focus on this because I'm going to come back to it for the Novacure story. I think of it as a window opening. When I would sit down with my parents, we'd discuss whether I should become a carpenter or maybe go to college. The next thing you know, I was at MIT. And I studied, and this will come back, I studied material science and engineering. It was my passion. I was an undergraduate and graduate student at MIT. And this is maybe the first bit of watch intersection. While I was a grad student at MIT, I developed the first practical electroluminescent lamps. And you may recall in the early days of LCD displays, if you wanted to look at it in the dark, the watch companies conveniently put a little light bulb in the corner. You pressed a button and that little light bulb illuminated that corner. Good luck in the dark. The electroluminescent lamps, and if we had more time, I could describe electroluminescence, but basically a special wide gap semiconductor is placed between two conductors. You create an electric field, and the electric field light is emitted. And again, we won't talk about how that happens. Part of the trick, though, is you need a transparent conductor so the light can get out. And importantly, these semiconductors, mostly zinc oxide, are very sensitive to moisture. So they weren't practical. So I figured out how to make them less sensitive to moisture. And I worked with a number of other people, started a company called Doyle, and we created the electroluminescence that went into the Timex Indiglo, if you remember that.
Incredible. I didn't know that.
Yes.
I had no idea about that.
And that was sort of a resurgence for Timex. And it started as the Indiglo and then the Iron Man. And that whole series of lamps came from my developments as a grad student. So I'll fast forward again. For me, it was incredibly interesting to work on, what essentially were consumer products. I knew nothing about business. I won't describe how little I made from this development, but I decided I needed to go and get some business training. So I went to Harvard Business School. And at Harvard, I decided I wanted to do something other than software, consumer technology. And I really decided at that point to dedicate my career to healthcare. And I did that for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, it's incredibly interesting. I'd love to say I wanted to help people as my, first number one. But honestly, number one is the science of the body, the chemistry, the electricity. It's just so fascinating. And we all have a body. We all have a brain. So, it's also something that's very personal to all of us. And unfortunately, we all know someone who's been ill. And, I learned this much later, but humans suffer from 60,000 diseases that we know of.
60,000?
60,000. And we have treatments for about 6,000 of the 60,000. So if you want to put that into perspective, where we stand, and it seems every time we get, one disease licked, we live a little longer, and then we get to experience a whole different level of diseases that are associated. So our ancestors didn't have to worry much about Alzheimer's because they died of infections long before the plaques took hold. Now we get to worry about a different set of diseases, but we still have to worry about them. And as my grad school, post Harvard Business School grad school, I went to work for Johnson & Johnson. And through a lucky string of coincidences, I ran or had the opportunity to run their medical device R&D. When I arrived, my labs were developing the cardiac stents. These are the little tubes of stainless steel that interventional cardiologists will put into a clogged artery. It seems like common practice today, but I can tell you in the 90s, the idea of putting a hunk of stainless steel in an artery was just mind-boggling. So we developed the stents, we launched them. And in the US, by the way, still the number one killer is heart disease. We've made tremendous strides, but it's still number one. And if you think of the heart, it's obviously a pump. It's got plumbing. The stents, cardiac bypass surgery are all focused on the plumbing, but it's also got an electrical system. And when the electrical system goes bad, you wind up with cardiac arrhythmias. And these are, tachycardia, things like AFib, and these affect a tremendous percentage of the population and can also be immediately fatal. So it turns out that when I got involved with looking for solutions for the electrical system, and here's where I'll connect the dots back to Israel, I ended up prospecting for technologies at the Technion, which is described often as Israel's MIT in Haifa. And I met a professor there, his name's Yoram Palti, who his expertise was the effects of electrical phenomenon on tissue. And I have to say, thankfully, again, back to my electroluminescent days, I knew what an electric field was at least. And he had developed a technology that would allow doctors to put a catheter from the leg, wind it up into the heart, and then make an electrical map of the inside of the heart. It was in his lab, and I came over and I found it and I acquired it for Johnson & Johnson, and then built a research and development and commercialization facility in Haifa. As we were approaching the commercialization of the biosense technology for cardiac application, Professor Palti called me again and said, I've got another idea. And I thought, okay, this is wonderful. Of course he does. And I was expecting another innovation to treat cardiac disease. But when we sat down over lunch, and literally, if I look around my messy office, I can find the napkin. But literally, sketched on a napkin, he described a completely different approach to treating cancer using the electrical properties of cells rather than their chemical properties, which of course are the targets for chemotherapy and all the modern pharmaceutical approaches. Now, of course, the issue with most cancer therapies is that you target the cancer, but it's very hard to differentiate the cancer from healthy cells. That's why we have cancer, because they're so good at hiding from our immune system, and it makes it highly difficult to treat. And of course, every cancer therapy, and we've all had either personal experience or family experience or friends experience, you know that the second word out of the oncologist's mouth is side effects. You know, this is the benefit, these are the side effects. And the side effects are a result of this very close relationship between cancer cells and healthy cells. We don't have side effects from antibiotics because bacteria are really different than our healthy cells. So we can target them without killing our cells. Cancer is a different story. But it turns out, and this was sort of a gift from nature, that in order to get the electric fields into the cells, we have to tune them. Because electrically, the cell membrane, you know, the bag in which all the cellular components are held, behaves electrically like a capacitor, which means that only certain frequencies of electric fields can get into the cells. And luckily, the frequencies of normal cells and the frequencies of cancer cells are different. So we're able to create an electric field, target the cancer cells, interrupt this cellular ballet of cell division, and fight the cancer. And this was the basis of Novacure. Again, literally restaurant napkin idea. And 23 years ago, and I like to admit that I was smart enough because I knew what an electric field was, but I was dumb enough because I had no idea what it would really take to develop a completely new approach to treating cancer, develop it, get it through the FDA and the other regulatory agencies, get it to doctors, get doctors to use it, and then get our payers, our insurance companies, our governments to pay for it. That mission's still ongoing, by the way. It's 23 years later. But we have this now new modality. It's not surgery, it's not radiation, it's not pharmacology. We call it tumor treating fields. The first cancer that we set about treating was the deadly brain cancer, glioblastoma. Fortunately for all of us, not a very prevalent cancer, but one, when you hear of people who have a brain cancer diagnosis and pass away, 12 months later, that's glioblastoma. And we've made a huge impact there. This phenomenon, though, that I described can be applied to any of the tumors in the head, chest, abdomen. And we're in the process right now of bringing the therapy to lung cancer, which is the most prevalent cancer still. And with a little good luck, next year to pancreatic cancer, which is another one of the super nasty cancers with no options. So I'll take a deep breath, Max, but that's my story.
That's quite a story, and I know you've kept it short. So Novacure has been treating brain cancer for how many years?
So we received our FDA approval for first-line brain cancer in 2016. So we're going on not quite 10 years, but 6 or 7.
Can you give us a few results?
There's a lot of ways to think about cancer results. But I think if I'm a patient, the most important number is what are my chances for a 5-year survival and beyond? And we just received the real world evidence from 2018 and 19. So the real world, not clinical trial, 5-year data. For patients who received a diagnosis and did not receive our therapy, the 5-year survival rate from glioblastoma is in the low single digits, 3%, say. With our therapy, the patients who received our therapy, we've raised that to 25%. And so it's a significant increase. And the second thing that we've discovered, and this is really a profound result, is that when you combine our therapy with immunotherapy, the way we kill the cells opens up the cells to the immune system, and we see dramatic improvements. And quite honestly, this is what keeps me going, is the opportunity to continue to drive these improvements.
And if I'm not wrong, there's virtually no side effects, am I right?
That's correct. We're able to target, so there's no systemic toxicity from our therapy.
It's mind-blowing. I remember the first time you spoke to me about that, and I thought it was science fiction. So thank you from the whole world for having created this. And it's great that you're going to different parts of the body. Now, we're talking about the future. What you created was science fiction just a few decades ago. When I sat down with you and asked you this very simple questions like, how do you see the future of healthcare? You took me through a roller coaster ride. Can you give us a bit of your vision of what you think is going to happen in healthcare in the next 10, 20 years? And don't sugarcoat it.
Yeah, sure. So, healthcare is a big, encompassing topic, but it all starts ultimately with human disease. And again, without going into the causes, when we were cavemen, our lifespan was in the 20 years or so because we would be eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, or if you broke your leg, you'd die, or you'd drink some dirty water and you'd die of some sort of infection. And, we've reached a point where our lifespans are, call it in the 80s. And this isn't my original thought, but our natural lifespans, let's say, are in the 20s, and everything between the 20s and the 80s is the result of technology, whether it's antibiotics or clean water. Those were two of the biggest, and now the therapies we have for heart disease and orthopedics. But a lot of our conditions are the result of failed body parts. So my view for the future, and this is not science fiction, it's coming, is that we're not going to help those organs limp along. We're going to replace them. Your kidneys have a problem, you're going to get a new kidney. Your heart's problem, new heart. Diabetes, we're not going to inject insulin, you're going to get a new pancreas. And we can go down the line. Now today, if you do have end-stage kidney disease, we do transplant kidneys. It's the largest organ that's transplanted. But there are two problems. The first is that when you take a kidney from one person and in the other, the immune system doesn't like it. And so even if it's a close relative, that recipient is going to be on immunosuppressive drugs for the rest of their lives, which means their susceptibility to infection, viral infection, fungal infection, bacterial infection is heightened. And an athlete's foot can lead to a really huge problem. And ultimately, those kidneys get rejected. Even if they last 10, 15 years, the combination of immunosuppressive drugs and just the stress. And so the recipients live with this almost black cloud. Now, for the other organs, there's just many fewer of them because we don't have two of everything, right? So you can't get a pancreas from your mother. You can't get a heart from your mother. You can't get a pair of lungs from your mother. So all of those come from motorcycle accidents. That's the source. And, so you have to get the roadkill. You have to get the organs out. Depending on where you are, they have to be an organ donor, and then they have to be transported in a very short period of time. They have to be healthy, and they have to be put in to the recipient. And then same thing, immunosuppression forever and ultimate rejection. So we have the second problem is very long lists. for these spare organs. So what's the combination that's required? The combination is, one, to solve the immunosuppression problem, number one, and number two, solve the supply problem. And I'm privileged to work with a very talented team of dedicated scientists who have been focusing on this issue, and also some very motivated financiers, because it takes both. And I think we're very close to solving both problems. Number one, we're going to solve, and I think this is happening now, the immune rejection problem, because we've figured out how to take a little bit of bone marrow from the donor and then in a very special way put it into the recipient so that the recipient's immune system sees self and sees the new organ as self. There's a lot of science behind this, but the trick is a little bit of bone marrow, just the right protocol. There's a special antibody that goes with this, and we can now transplant organs without immunosuppression. The second problem, of course, is the source. And the answer to the source, and this might surprise you, might not, is going to be what they call xenotransplantation, which is taking organs from animals, and specifically in this case from pigs. Pigs' systems are very similar to ours. They're bigger, and so the same group of talented scientists have been inbreeding a colony of miniature, genetically identical pigs. So imagine what dog breeders have done over decades to get a miniature schnauzer. It's the same thing. So we have a colony now of miniature human-size organs, and the same immunosuppression protocol now can be used with organs from size-adapted pigs and be transplanted into humans. So forget that insulin, forget those stents and heart meds, and forget dialysis. I think you're going to just get, when your organ's tired out, you're going to get a new one from a nice, young, healthy piglet.
Totally incredible. Now, at the same time, science and pharma are spending gazillions trying to find cures, and at the same time, human beings are destroying themselves. We had a conversation about sugar, and that was an eye-opener for me. I knew it. I know that we've all been consuming much too much sugar, but maybe can you take us through that?
I believe sugar's poison. The first and foremost is we shouldn't drink soda. Okay, that is literal poison, and you drink less of it in Europe, but in the US, it's, for a lot of kids, it's their drinking water. And unfortunately, fruit juices, even though we may think they're healthy, are in the same category. Fruit has a lot of sugar too. I'm not saying don't eat fruit, but at least you get the fiber and you get some other benefits. But fruit juice and soda should be off everybody's list immediately.
So basically, we're creating generations of people who will be insulin resistant. And at the moment when they will need it, because they will have the illnesses, it won't work anymore.
Well, and that's what we're seeing, right? That's the explosion of type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance at the end of the day. Type 1 is your pancreas can't make insulin. Type 2 is insulin resistance. And we've reached a stage of the evolution of Homo sapiens where hard work is done from a chair, right? Not in a field. And perversely, we evolved in a world of scarcity. And so our body is hardwired to eat. And now in a world of plenty, and unfortunately, plenty of bad, cheap calories, this hardwiring drives this insatiable desire for sugar and unhealthy food.
I could continue talking for hours on healthcare, but I just want to pivot a little bit and come back to your first love of material science. We started talking early on when we met about exotic materials, and you were immediately, can you make me a tungsten watch? Can you make me
we'll do that
a niobium
someday.
watch or a vanadium? I can't remember. I mean, you went through the whole Mbandf table with me. What attracts you? But more importantly, just let's come back to What is this passion for exotic materials?
So I mentioned that I was trained at MIT, and I explained my path from probably becoming a carpenter to winding up at this candy store at MIT. And at MIT, we don't have majors. We have what they call courses of study. And MIT was founded as a technical institute where science and practical training would be combined. Because until that time, at least in the US, you either went to a liberal arts college and studied, and you could study physics or you could study biology, or you went off into an apprenticeship and you learned, blacksmithing or one of the trades. So MIT was, and it was actually modeled on some German institutes that had evolved in the early 1800s, but it combined the two, study of science with the practical arts. And they numbered the courses. So there was course 1, which was civil engineering, course 2, mechanical engineering, course 3, which is material science and engineering, but they didn't have that then. Course 3 was mining engineering. So it was civil, mechanical, and mining. But mining morphed into mining and metallurgy, and then metallurgy and material science. And by the time I got there, it was material science and engineering. And for me, it was the real practical intersection between science, my love, solid state physics, the behavior of atoms in materials, and something practical, because I still needed to get a job. So at least I felt like I couldn't go off into the realms of theoretical physics because I was still worried that I needed to be practically employed. So that was the intersection. And it became a passion. And, I described my graduate work in electroluminescent materials. I studied semiconductors. I studied superconductors. And so as a lot of the technology at Novacure is based on, we didn't talk about this, but very exotic ceramic materials to deliver those electric fields that we discussed. But it's always been kind of a secret passion. And when I discovered watches, in large regard thanks to you, and particularly the strange world of independent watchmaking, where, as you remark, but as I passionately believe, this intersection of science, engineering, and art, where you get to wear your art on your wrist, or wear your Ferrari on your wrist, depending on how you look at it. It's not on your bedroom wall or in a garage somewhere. You get to take it out in public. I was just blown away. I found my home. I found my passion. And then I started understanding more about what went into the movements. MB&F, some of your friends, Kari Voutilainen, one of the first watches of his that I acquired was in a tantalum case.
I remember that piece, the Tantalor, if I'm not wrong.
I am the current steward of the tantalum.
Extraordinary piece in the history of Kari, yeah.
Yes. And then I began to discover that, there's more than steel, platinum, and gold, right? Some of your pieces in zirconium, so exciting. There's a long story I can't tell, but I always was fascinated by niobium. Niobium is, named after Niobe, which was one of the, the progeny of Tantalus, because it's an element that was discovered in trace quantities in tantalum. But it was the first superconductor. Well, I guess germanium and niobium. So the original low temperature superconductors. And I mentioned I had a real fascination with superconductivity. So, I challenged Kari to see if he'd make me a watch in a niobium case, which he did.
It's incredible.
Which I have a Kari, piece unique in a niobium case. So I have your zirconium, I have tantalum, I have niobium, and I'll get my tungsten case, I hope, before it's all over. That's incredibly...
So is that the Grail? Is that the one you're looking for?
That's Grail to me. And for those of you out there, tungsten is what they make machine tools out of. It's what they make the nozzles when you process steel out of. It's the hardest element. It's the most difficult to machine. It's going to be tricky to polish, but we'll figure out how to do it. It's also super heavy. If you hand someone a small cube of tungsten, they're shocked by the density. So it's going to be cool. But that's, a source of my passion. I'm also passionate about everything in the M.A.D.Gallery. I walk in there like a kid in a candy shop. And, next time you're in New York, you say you only have one M.A.D. lab in the U.S. You don't realize you have another. It just happens to be my apartment in New York.
Thanks, Bill. I'm very aware of your time being precious. I just spent an incredible time with you, and I'm sure the listeners too. And I just want to thank you. You bring a whole new world to us, and keep on doing what you're doing because it helps us all. So thank you very much, Bill.
Well, and thank you, Max.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode. Thank you for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed our conversation with Bill Doyle and that you had a glimpse at his fascinating journey. We'll soon be back for a conversation with another of our tribe members. If you enjoyed today's episode, remember to subscribe to our podcast so as not to miss our next conversation. Stay curious, keep exploring, and cherish your madness.